Picture this: a drawing room in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of afternoon that should mean nothing. Pale winter light coming through tall windows, a fire that someone had built too large for the hour, and Winifred Balfour standing at the edge of the room in a gray wool dress that was not her dress, holding a tray of correspondence that was not her correspondence, watching the man who had inherited everything that should have been hers announce to a room full of his friends that he had found the woman he intended to marry. The woman was seated across from him on the blue settee. She was very pretty. She wore yellow. She laughed at something he said with the easy, unguarded laugh of someone who had never been required to calculate the cost of laughing. Winifred set the tray on the side table without a sound. She turned toward the door. She left, not quickly, not with her face doing anything that anyone watching would have remembered. She simply walked out of the drawing room the way she walked in and out of every room in Harwick House, invisibly, efficiently, as though she were furniture that had learned to move on its own. Behind her, the fire crackled. The woman in yellow laughed again. And Winifred Balfour, who had grown up in that house, who had been born in the bedroom at the top of the east stairs, who had once had a name in this county that meant something, allowed herself exactly 10 steps down the corridor before she stopped. Pressed her back against the wall, closed her eyes. She did not cry. She was well past crying, but something happened in those 10 seconds in that corridor. Something quiet and irrevocable. Something she would not fully understand until much later when she was somewhere else entirely and the understanding had time to settle into words. She had been waiting for this house to take her back. She had been waiting for 2 years, patient and careful and invisible, and she understood in that moment that waiting was finished. What came next was up to her. She had not always been the girl who carried trays. Winifred Margaret Balfour had been born the only child of Thomas Balfour, who had built Harwick House from near nothing across 30 years of careful management and considerable intelligence, and Catherine Balfour née Sutton, who had died when Winifred was 9 and left behind a jewelry box, a collection of botanical watercolors, and a daughter with her exact gray eyes and her exact tendency to see more than was comfortable. Her father had been a self-made man, which was a phrase people used in those years with a particular inflection that contained both admiration and a faint, well-concealed condescension. He had made himself thoroughly: the house, the land, the reputation, the place in county society that was not quite aristocratic but close enough to matter. He had given Winifred an education that most girls of her time did not receive, not because he was progressive in any philosophical sense, but because he believed that a person with land and assets needed to understand them, and Winifred was the only person he had left to leave them to. She had understood them. She had understood them extremely well, and then her father had died, and the will had arrived, and Winifred had learned 2 things in the same afternoon. The first was that her father, in the last 18 months of his life, had formed a partnership with a man named Aldous Crane. The second was that this partnership, as written, gave Aldous Crane the right to manage and ultimately inherit the Harwick estate in the event of Thomas Balfour's death, provided his son, singular, Geoffrey Crane, took up residence and continued operations within a specified period. She had asked Mr. Petherwick, the solicitor, to explain this to her 3 times. He had explained it 3 times in the same careful, sympathetic voice, which told her he had expected to need 3 explanations. The will was binding. It was also, she was nearly certain, not entirely what her father had intended. But her father was dead, and intention was not a legal instrument, and Aldous Crane had arrived at Harwick House within a fortnight, with his son and a great deal of luggage, and the expression of a man who had been waiting for something to become officially his. Winifred had 6 weeks to vacate. She had spent 4 of those 6 weeks in a state of such concentrated fury that she could not afterward clearly remember them. She had spent the remaining 2 thinking, and then she had done something that no one who knew her would have predicted, which was partly why it worked. She went back. Not as Winifred Balfour. Not with her name and her history and the decades of her family's presence in every room of that house. She went back as a hired woman, a lady's companion for Geoffrey Crane's new fiancée, a quiet, competent, gray-dressed person with a reference letter from a Mrs. Petherwick, the solicitor's wife, who owed Winifred a favor she was disinclined to enumerate, and the kind of face that people look through rather than at. She had always had that face. She had never considered it useful until now. The fiancée's name was Rosalind Peck. She was the daughter of a prosperous merchant from Dorset, 23 years old, very pretty, and possessed of a sweetness that Winifred found, despite her best intentions, genuinely difficult to resent. Rosalind liked yellow dresses. She laughed easily. She was kind to servants, with the slightly self-conscious kindness of someone who had been told this, was important, and had taken the instructions seriously. She was not the enemy. Geoffrey Crane was 31. He had his father's dark coloring and his mother's square jaw, and neither parent's intelligence, though he had a version of intelligence that sometimes passed for the real thing in rooms where the real thing was not being carefully assessed. He was confident in the way that men who have been told they are capable tend to be confident, not through demonstrated competence, but through the accumulated weight of being believed. He managed the estate the way a man manages something he has inherited rather than built, with the casual authority of someone who has never had to justify their presence in a room. He had not, in Winifred's careful observation, spent 2 minutes thinking about where Harwick House had come from. She spent 6 weeks thinking about nothing else. Her room was in the east wing, small, clean, looking out over the kitchen garden that her father had planted 20 years ago. She knew every inch of the grounds. She knew which flagstone in the front hall had lifted slightly since the frost of '82 and needed to be watched. She knew that the east chimney drew badly in north wind, and that the upper library had a damp patch in the far corner that had been reported twice and never properly addressed. She knew where the household accounts were kept, and more importantly, she had begun to understand what was in them. The housekeeper was a woman named Mrs. Torrance, stout and sensible and deeply skeptical of everything, who had worked at Harwick House for 11 years and had formed no particular loyalty to the Crane family in the time they had been in residence. She did not know who Winifred was, but she recognized a woman who knew which stone in the front hall needed watching, and she treated her, after the first cautious week, with the slightly grudging respect of a professional acknowledging another professional. Through Mrs. Torrance, and through the quiet, careful work of being unnoticed, Winifred began to learn what Geoffrey Crane had done with her father's estate since taking possession. It was not good. She had suspected some of it. She had not suspected all of it. The full picture assembled itself slowly, the way water finds the cracks in a foundation, not all at once but steadily, and with increasing damage the longer it went unaddressed. Geoffrey had sold the north pasture land at a price that suggested either significant ignorance of its value or a private arrangement she could not yet prove. He had borrowed against the property twice in 18 months. The household expenditure had increased by 1/3, while the income from the tenant farms had declined. Not because the farms were failing. The farms were well managed. They were well managed because Winifred's father had spent years building relationships with the tenants that did not disappear, simply because the name on the deed changed, but because Geoffrey was charging the tenants less than their leases required, and pocketing what he was told were goodwill adjustments. Winifred did not know yet what he was doing with the difference. She intended to find out. She wrote to Mr. Petherwick on a Thursday, a carefully worded letter that did not use her name and asked questions framed as clarifications from a friend managing a similar estate situation. Mr. Petherwick, who was not an unintelligent man, replied within a week. His letter contained the information she had requested, and, at the bottom, in handwriting slightly smaller than the rest, the phrase, "I hope the party making these inquiries is well and has not been discouraged in her efforts." She wrote back, "She has not." On a Wednesday evening 4 weeks into her residence, Rosalind asked Winifred to stay after dinner and help her with the seating arrangements for a gathering Geoffrey intended to host. It was to be a substantial affair. 30 guests, a dinner and an evening of cards, the county's prominent families, the kind of event her father had hosted twice a year, with the attention to logistics that made it look effortless and the understanding that effortlessness of this kind required genuine effort. They sat in the morning room with the guest list between them. Rosalind was capable but uncertain, aware that the social geography of the county was more complicated than she had been briefed on. Winifred helped her. She knew which families did not sit comfortably near which others. She knew who had to be placed close to the host for reasons of business obligation and who could be quietly seated toward the window without offense. She knew that the Holbrook family, if invited, required the older son on a separate table from the younger, and that Lady Marnwick ate nothing with cream after an incident at the Fenbridge Assembly that was never explicitly discussed, but widely remembered. She arranged the seating with the precision of someone who had been doing it since she was 17, seated across from Rosalind in her own father's morning room, giving away information she had accumulated over a lifetime as though it were impersonal expertise. Rosalind said, at the end of the evening, "I don't know what I would do without you. You know this county better than anyone." "I grew up nearby," Winifred said, which was true. The gathering happened on a Saturday in November. 30 guests arrived. The house looked exactly as it should, because Winifred had spent 2 days quietly redirecting the preparations through Mrs. Torrance, not visibly, not in any way that attached to her name, but with the steady efficiency of someone who knows exactly what is required and how to make sure it happens. The flowers in the entrance hall were arranged properly. The wine was opened in the right sequence. The dining room temperature was correct, which it had not been at the last dinner because no one had known to bank the kitchen fires 2 hours earlier. Geoffrey did not notice. He moved through his own gathering with the easy confidence of a man taking credit for weather he had not forecast. Winifred moved through the evening as she moved through everything, serving, arranging, available when needed and invisible otherwise. She refilled glasses. She managed 2 small disasters in the kitchen before they became visible to the dining room. She caught, from across the room during the card portion of the evening, the moment when Colonel Harbridge said something to Geoffrey about the north pasture that made Geoffrey go briefly, carefully still. She noted this. She noted everything. The colonel was one of the oldest landowners in the county. He had known her father. He had known Winifred as a child. She had sat in this same room and listened to him tell stories about the county's history with the focused attention of someone who understood that stories like this were a form of education. He had not recognized her tonight. She had not expected him to. She had been 19 the last time he saw her, in a room where she was the daughter of the house and wore accordingly. Tonight she was gray wool and a careful face and a tray. But he had looked at her twice, the second time with a slight, unresolved expression, the expression of a man who cannot locate a memory that is present somewhere in his mind. She did not help him locate it. Not yet. On a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the gathering, Geoffrey came to find Rosalind in the morning room where she and Winifred were working on correspondence. He was in high spirits, which with Jeffrey meant a kind of expansive, slightly unfocused energy. The look of a man who has decided something and found the deciding pleasant. "I've been thinking," he said, settling into the chair by the window, with the ease of someone who sits in chairs without wondering whose chair it is, "that we ought to do something about the East Wing. The rooms there are wasted. I've spoken to a builder in Treswick about converting the upper floor into guest suites." Winifred did not look up from the letter she was copying. The East Wing, where she had been born, where her mother had painted watercolors of roses and beech trees and left them stacked against the wall in a particular order Winifred had memorized. That would require taking down the interior wall between the second and third rooms, she said, in the tone of someone citing a logistical concern. The structural report from 1879 noted load-bearing features in that section. It would need to be reassessed before any conversion. Jeffrey looked at her. It was the look of a man hearing competence from an unexpected direction, not suspicious, not impressed, simply recalibrating. "Do you know the property well?" he asked. "I grew up nearby," she said again. "One hears things." He left it, but she caught him as he turned to go, glancing at her one moment longer than the exchange required. She had grown too useful. She had known this was a risk. The risk of being invisible is that it can become invisible competence. And competence, unlike presence, is difficult to overlook indefinitely. She wrote to Mr. Petherwick that evening. His reply arrived 4 days later, and this time it was longer, and it contained something she had not expected. A clause from the original partnership agreement between her father and Aldous Crane that had been, not fraudulently, but perhaps conveniently, excluded from the summary presented to Winifred at the reading of the will. She read it twice. She set it down. She looked out the window at the kitchen garden, at the bare stalks of the rosebeds her father had planted 20 years ago, at the East Wing where she had been born, and she felt something she had not felt in 2 years. Something like ground under her feet. She had found it. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. The clause required that the estate operations maintain the standard of income and management established in the 3 years prior to partnership. Her father's standard, documented, on record. If that standard was not met, the terms of the inheritance could be contested, and the North Pasture sale, the borrowed funds, the adjusted tenant payments. They were not meeting it. Jeffrey Crane had not managed what he had been given. He had diminished it, and she could prove it. She did not act immediately. She had spent 2 years practicing patience. She could practice it a little longer. The woman who changed everything arrived on a Friday in December. Her name was Harriet. Not the Harriet on any list Winifred might have prepared. This Harriet was Harriet Crane, Jeffrey's younger sister, who had been in Edinburgh visiting an aunt, and arrived unannounced with 3 trunks and the expression of a woman who had decided something significant. Winifred recognized her immediately, not personally, but by type. The kind of woman who comes back from somewhere she was sent to be managed and is no longer manageable. Harriet Crane was 26. She had Jeffrey's dark coloring but different eyes, sharper, quicker, the eyes of someone who had been paying attention to different things. She moved through the house in her first 48 hours with the focused curiosity of a person taking inventory. She noticed Winifred on the second day, not in the way Jeffrey noticed her as useful background. Harriet noticed her the way Winifred noticed things, steadily, with an undercurrent of question. "You arranged the flower display in the entrance hall," Harriet said, on the Wednesday morning, finding Winifred in the corridor. It was not a question. "I assisted Mrs. Torrance," Winifred said. "Mrs. Torrance has been here 11 years and those arrangements have never looked like that." Harriet studied her. "Who are you?" "I'm Miss Balfour," Winifred said. "I serve as companion to Miss Peck." Something moved through Harriet's expression, a recognition that stopped just short of declaration. "Balfour," she said almost to herself. Then, "Thomas Balfour built this house." "Yes," Winifred said, "I believe he did." The silence between them was, for perhaps 4 seconds, the most honest Winifred had experienced in 2 years. "I see," Harriet said finally, and walked away. She came back the following morning. She came to Winifred's room, which no one had done, which required a decision and a reason, and she sat down in the chair by the window and said, without preamble, "I didn't know about the clause. What I mean is, I knew my father did business with yours. I didn't know the extent of what that meant until I came back and started asking questions that apparently no one expected me to ask." Winifred watched her. "Jeffrey is going to run this place into the ground," Harriet said. It was not a performance of family loyalty or an apology. It was a fact stated by someone who had looked at the accounts and drawn a conclusion. He's already selling things he shouldn't be able to sell and borrowing against things he doesn't fully understand. Your father built something real. My brother is treating it like furniture to be rearranged. Why are you telling me this? Winifred asked. Harriet looked at her with those quick, direct eyes. Because I've spent 2 days trying to determine whether you're here to observe or to act, and I think it's the second one. I think you've been collecting something, and I think whatever you've found is connected to what I found in the account books last night. A long pause. I've been speaking with Mr. Petherwick, Winifred said. The solicitor, my father's solicitor, yes. Something in Harriet settled, not relaxation but resolution, the expression of a person who has located the correct doorway and is preparing to walk through it. What do you need? She asked. What Winifred needed, it turned out, was a witness. Not to the documents. She had those. Mr. Petherwick had those. The record was there, and traceable, and more solid than she had initially understood. What she needed was someone inside the house who had seen the management decisions being made, the casual, unconsidered decisions of a man who had never questioned his right to make them. Harriet had seen them. Harriet had seen all of them. They worked for 3 weeks. They worked carefully, quietly, in the way that Winifred had learned to work in the past 2 years. Without announcement, without urgency, building something piece by piece until it was solid enough to hold weight. Colonel Harbridge came for dinner in January. He had come for dinner twice a year since the Crane family had taken possession of the house, less than before but present enough, to suggest the obligation of old acquaintance. He arrived and spoke with Jeffrey for 20 minutes about land prices, and arrived in the drawing room afterward with the distracted expression of a man whose confidence in his host has not been confirmed by the conversation. He found Winifred arranging the fire screen. He stopped. That same expression from the night of the gathering, the unresolved memory, the slight frown of something trying to locate itself. Miss Balfour, she said quietly, before he could frame the question. Tom Balfour's daughter. We met here several times when I was young. He looked at her for a long moment. The color of the memory clarified. Good God, he said very quietly, what are you doing? I'm determining what belongs to me, Winifred said, with the same evenness she had used for 2 years. And I expect I'm nearly finished. Colonel Harbridge was 72. He had known her father for 40 years. He sat down in the chair nearest the fireplace and said nothing for a full half-minute. What do you need from me? He asked. The formal inquiry began on a Wednesday in February. This was not dramatic in the way that legal proceedings sometimes appear to be from outside. It was paperwork and meetings and the careful, unhurried language of men who are paid to be precise. Mr. Petherwick managed it. Colonel Harbridge provided testimony. Harriet Crane provided the account records she had identified, with annotations in a handwriting that was not Jeffrey's. Jeffrey was not present for the initial stages. He was, as he was frequently in London. He returned to Harwick House on a Thursday to find that the nature of his management of the estate was under formal review, that his sister had provided documentation to his father's former solicitor's counterpart in a legal proceeding she had not consulted him about, and that there was a letter waiting from his own solicitor that he read 3 times in the study with the expression of a man reading his own sentence. He called for Winifred. She came to the study. She sat down across from him with the steady hands of a woman who had spent 2 years preparing for exactly this room, this conversation, this chair. "You are Thomas Balfour's daughter," he said. "Not a question. I am." He looked at her for a long time. She could see him tracing it backward, every efficient arrangement, every logistical insight, every quiet correction that had made his house run better than it should have under his management. He was not a stupid man. He was a man who had made the mistake of not looking closely enough at the people around him. "You came here under a false name," he said. "I came here under my own name," Winifred said. "I chose not to announce my history. There's a difference." A pause. Outside the study window, the kitchen garden sat bare in the February light, the rose beds, the stone path her father had laid himself, because he said a man should know how to do something useful with his hands. "What is it you want?" Geoffrey asked, and unlike so many things he said, it came out without performance. It was a genuine question. Winifred looked at him. She had thought about this. She had thought about it with the same care she had given every other part of this. Not from anger, not from triumph, but from the clear and patient understanding of what was actually true and what was actually possible. "I want what my father built to be managed the way he built it," she said. "I want the tenant agreements honored at the rates he established. I want the North Pasture situation examined properly. I want the documentation of the partnership reviewed with full disclosure of the clause Mr. Petherwick has identified." She paused. "I am not asking you to give me anything that was not already mine, Geoffrey. I am asking you to stop taking things that were." He had no answer for this. She had known he wouldn't. He left the study 20 minutes later without having achieved anything he had come in expecting to achieve. She sat in her father's chair for a long moment after he'd gone, her hands folded in her lap, looking at the room she had grown up in, the room she had not sat in 2 years. It smelled the same. Old wood and coal smoke and something underneath those things she could not name and did not need to, because she had known it her whole life. It smelled like home. The resolution, when it came, was not a single moment. It was a series of them, assembled over 6 weeks of legal process, with the patience that the law requires and Winifred had learned to have. The clause held. The income records held. The North Pasture transaction was found to be in violation of the partnership terms. Geoffrey's solicitor was, by all accounts, not pleased with his client. Aldous Crane came once, in March, to try what his son's approach had not achieved. He was a harder man than Geoffrey. This was where Geoffrey's confident manner had come from, the copy always slightly less precise than the original. He sat across from Winifred in the morning room and deployed, in sequence, 4 different forms of argument: appeal to reason, appeal to sentiment, suggestion of alternative compensation, and finally, a version of threat framed as practical advice. Winifred listened to all of it. She had become very good at listening. "Mr. Crane," she said when he finished, "I believe you were a capable partner to my father in some respects. I believe the arrangement between you was made in good faith, or most of it. I am not attempting to impugn your character or your business judgment." She looked at him steadily. "But the terms were not met. That is documented and witnessed, and not a matter of argument at this point. What I am offering you is the chance to participate in a resolution that reflects the original intent of the partnership. As my father understood it, the alternative is to continue through the legal process, which Mr. Petherwick informs me will become increasingly unfavorable to the current management as the income records are fully examined. A pause. My father, she said, and her voice was even, spent 30 years building this. He built it for me. I intend to have it. Aldous Crane looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression. Not softness, not quite. More like recognition. The look of a man who has met a counterpart in an unexpected place. He signed the agreement in April. The morning she became the official owner of Harwick House again, Winifred woke at 5:30 and could not go back to sleep. She lay in the East Wing bedroom, her original bedroom, which she had moved back into 2 weeks earlier, and listened to the house settle around her in the early cold. At 6, she got up. She put on her wool coat, the gray one, the companion's coat. She had not replaced it yet and was not sure she would immediately, and went out through the kitchen to the garden. It was April. The rose beds were beginning. Small, tentative suggestions of green at the base of the canes her father had planted, the ones she had watched from this same window across 30 years of springs. Knowing them the way you know things you have grown up alongside. She walked the garden in the early light without direction, touching nothing, looking at everything. Mrs. Torrance appeared at the kitchen door at 6:30, looked at her standing among the rose beds in the gray morning, and said nothing for a moment. Then, I'll start the fires. Coffee will be ready in 20 minutes. Thank you, Mrs. Torrance, Winifred said. The housekeeper started to go back inside, then stopped. Miss Balfour, she said. Not Miss, not the companion's not quite name she had used for months. Miss Balfour, with the weight of a full title. Welcome home. Winifred looked at her. Something in her chest, which had been held very still for a very long time, shifted. Thank you, she said. I'll be in for coffee directly. Harriet came that same afternoon. She arrived with her 3 trunks, which had been in the guest room for months, and asked, with the directness that Winifred had come to find entirely refreshing, whether she might stay on for a while. She was not, she said, in any particular hurry to return to Edinburgh. The county was proving more interesting than anticipated. Stay as long as you like, Winifred said. Geoffrey is not going to forgive you, Harriet said. I know. He'll say you deceived him. I was in my own house, Winifred said, using my own name. Whatever he decides to say about that is his choice to make. Harriet studied her. Then she smiled, which she did not do often, and which, when she did, was entirely worth waiting for. He said before he left for London that you were the cleverest person he had ever been entirely wrong about. That's the most honest thing he's ever said, Winifred said. She meant it without unkindness. Colonel Harbridge came in May. He came for dinner and stayed 3 hours, and talked about her father, the way people talk about someone, when they want to confirm that the memory is still there, still accurate, still worth keeping. He told her about the year her father had first broken ground for the house, about the way he had walked the land for 2 days before deciding where to put the foundation, about a conversation they'd had by the river the autumn of 1869 that Colonel Harbridge had been thinking about, on and off, for 20 years. Winifred listened. She asked the right questions. She had her mother's watercolors brought down from the East Wing where they had been stored, and she hung them in the morning room, in the order she had memorized long ago. Your father would be proud of you, the colonel said, on his way out. She thought about this afterward, standing in the entrance hall alone. The flagstone that needed watching, the east chimney, the damp patch in the library corner that she had properly repaired. She thought she might be proud of herself, too. That was not a feeling she was used to. She turned it over carefully, the way you turn over something unfamiliar to determine its weight and composition, to understand what it is before deciding where to put it. It was real. It was hers. It had cost something to earn, which was the thing about real things. They tended to. On a Tuesday morning in June, Winifred sat at her father's desk in the study and looked out at the grounds. The rose beds were in full bloom. The kitchen garden was producing well. Mr. Petherwick had sent a letter about the tenant agreements, all of them now restored to the proper rates, and 3 of the tenants had written to Winifred directly. 2 of them, men who had known her father, one who had been in his tenancy for 22 years, and written in the careful, formal hand of someone who does not write letters often, but understood this one was worth the effort. She wrote back to all 3. She wrote back to Mr. Petherwick. She wrote a brief, cordial note to Geoffrey, because there were still matters of the estate transition that required communication, and she had decided that clarity and bitterness could not comfortably occupy the same space, and she preferred clarity. She was running her father's house. She was running it the way he had run it, with attention and honesty, and the understanding that a thing worth building was worth understanding all the way down. She had the accounts in order, the land properly tended, the household working with the efficient warmth of a place that was being actually managed rather than maintained for appearances. It was not easy. It was harder, in some ways, than the 2 years before. The 2 years before had required endurance. This required judgment, and judgment was always harder than endurance because it was never finished. It had to be made again every day, about everything. She found she was equal to it. Harriet, who had stayed, and who was proving to be someone Winifred would have sought out in any version of her life, came into the study one afternoon in July and set down a cup of coffee and said, without sitting, "Mrs. Torrance mentioned the drains along the north kitchen wall need looking at." "I know," Winifred said. "I've written to the builder in Treswick. Not the one Geoffrey used, a different one." Harriet made a sound that was not quite a laugh but contained all the components of one. "He came by, you know, Geoffrey, last week when you were in Treswick." Winifred looked up. "He didn't come to the house," Harriet said. "He stood at the gate for a few minutes. I saw him from the upper window." A pause. "Then he left." Winifred considered this for a moment. She thought about Geoffrey standing at the gate of a house he had been given, and had not understood, looking at something he had lost not through bad luck, but through the accumulated weight of not paying attention. She felt for him something she had not expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not anger, something quieter than either. "He'll find his way," she said. "He's not a bad man. He's a man who was handed something he wasn't ready for and didn't know to ask for help." Harriet raised an eyebrow. "I can feel that without forgiving the rest of it," Winifred said. "Both things can be true at the same time." She picked up Mr. Petherwick's letter. She began to read. Outside the study window, the rose beds were in the full red and gold excess of late July. The stone path her father had laid with his own hands was warm in the afternoon light. The east wing stood exactly as it should stand, its windows open, the watercolors on the morning room wall visible from the garden in the way her mother might have arranged them if she had lived long enough to decide. The house was hers. The name was hers. The name on the deed was Winifred Margaret Balfour, as it had always been intended to be, as clear and permanent as the stone in the front hall that needed watching, and the east chimney that drew badly in a north wind, and all the 10,000 particular things about a particular place that you only know because you grew up there and paid attention. She had paid attention. She set down the letter. She picked up her pen. She got back to work.